So nice to see such a great crowd out tonight on a lovely Wednesday evening. Hi, I'm Sara. I'm one of the workers for Between the Lines. We're the publishers of tonight's featured book, Law at Work, The Coercion and Co-option of the Working Class by Harry Glasbeek. We're so excited for tonight's book talk. We have the author here for tonight's discussion. I'm going to introduce our speaker and the book in just a moment, but a couple things first. Firstly, we would like to start off tonight's event by acknowledging that we are on stolen land here in Takaranto, traditional Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee territory, subject to the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. This land was stewarded by the Mississauga of the Credit River and is home today to many Indigenous peoples, including those displaced from their homelands by Canadian extractive and other industries. So we welcome everyone joining here tonight to reflect upon the lands in which you live, and we encourage you to work in solidarity with Indigenous movements. Secondly, for those of you who have not heard of us before, Between the Lines is a social movement press founded in 1977, so we've been around for a while. We're located here in Toronto, just down the street in the 401 Richmond building. We are a proudly left-wing book press. The books we publish reflect our activist roots and our commitment to social justice struggles. Something that's rather unique about us is that we are run collectively. So our staff collective is organized horizontally. This is very unusual even in the left-wing publishing industry. Our books are chosen by consensus by a volunteer editorial committee. We have no manager, no owner, and that's why our tagline is Books Without Bosses. We can't think of a better book to publish with us than many of Harry's books. BTL is also one of the founding members of Publishers for Palestine, a global solidarity collective of more than 400 publishers committed to the liberation of Palestine. We continue to host a growing list of free books and reading materials on the website publishersforpalestine.org, which we encourage you to check out. Our recent campaign to document occurrences of censorship and reprisal launched this past February. It's a tracking project to document crackdowns on Palestinian solidarity and the silencing of Palestinian voices in the book publishing industry. To learn more about it, please check out publishersforpalestine.org, and there's a form there that you can use to report and document any censorship happening within the publishing industry, which has been in the news quite a bit recently. To learn more about Between the Lines or Publishers for Palestine, we're just over here. Please come say hi and learn more about the books that we publish. So to begin tonight's event, firstly, we want to extend a huge congratulations to Harry for putting together this important book, hopefully not his last, with a lot of thought-provoking analysis about the role of the legal system and worker exploitation and what we can do to organize to fight back. We also want to give a huge thanks to the Workers' Action Center for being our host tonight, and to the Mayworks Festival of Working People in the Arts, for including this event in their annual programming. And if you haven't heard of Mayworks, it's a labor arts festival. There's one based here in Toronto, but there are others across Canada, bringing together a whole month of programming by folks who are both artists and workers, challenging a lot of the issues today that workers and artists face. So they have a whole program of events happening this month, and I definitely encourage you to check it out. Starting now, I think our author will begin with a short talk, and then audience members are encouraged to engage, comment, and ask questions afterwards. Harry said he wanted to save most of the time for audience engagement, so get those questions ready. Now to move to our featured speaker and book. Harry Glasbeek is Professor Emeritus and Senior Scholar of Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. He has taught in both Australia and Canada and has written 140 articles and 12 books, including BTL titles such as Wealth by Stealth, Corporate Crime, Corporate Law, and the Perversion of Democracy, Class Privilege, How Law Shelters Shareholders and Coddles Capitalism, and Capitalism, a Crime Story. He lives here in Toronto, Ontario. In this latest book, Harry unpacks how law has been used to ensure that workers' aspirations are kept in check, and will encourage the audience to envision a future where the law truly serves the interests of all. Law at Work shows how the very laws designed to safeguard rights and freedoms often act as invisible shackles, compelling us to reflect on our own struggles as we navigate a world where the legal system fails to serve our interests. So this thought-provoking book is an indispensable resource for those seeking to understand the hidden dynamics of worker oppression, and empowering us to imagine a different future for us. So why don't I hand it over to Harry? The floor is all yours.
I'm pleased to see you all here. I'm sure BTL is, and pleased to be part of the Mayworks Festival program, of course. That's sort of nice. I should say, when you write a book like this, you know it's not very useful. Not many people read it, not even those of you who are holding it. But you just hope that somehow it will make a small contribution. In my case, a contribution to activists and workers out there who want a more humane world than the one we're enduring. That would be nice. It will be my last book, regardless of PTL's wishes. What's in this book is my concern with the law as playing a role in capital labor regulatory system that ensures that one class, the working class, remains subjugated to the other class, the capitalist class. Now, it does so quite effectively. And it does so effectively in large part because law is able to hold itself out as doing the exact opposite. It claims to make it easy for us to interact, which it does. It provides some kind of coordination for us so we don't run into each other too much, and it provides daily instruments for what we need, tells us how to behave, right? Drive on the right-hand side of the road makes sense if we all do it. That should be a lesson for some police officers, I think. Or wear a hat when you go on a construction site, or there should be X amount of notice when you want to evict someone from the I hope this applies to none of you. And we have rules like that. They're just instruments. They're legal tools to coordinate and facilitate our interactions. And it provides some dispute resolution mechanisms so that when we disagree about the utility of a rule, its purpose, whether it should stay on the books or not, it does all of that. And most encounters with people with the law are at that level. That's what law is for them. That's how they see it every time they go somewhere. Strangely enough, you could change all those rules and nothing much would happen. For instance, if we had a rule that we had to drive on the left-hand side of the rule, no profound change in social relations would occur. None. And the same with all the other examples I gave. They're just instruments, they're tools. But law does much more than that. It also makes an assumption that in fact we're a society in which we have a sort of unstated, badly articulated consensus. That we all agree in a general sense on our objectives and on the norms by which we want to live. And law offers mechanisms to make sure that we all think that and feel that. So it has a very special form of reasoning, that it makes decisions by reasoning, which we try to keep hidden because we don't want other people to get in on the act. But it has a special form of rationality and criteria which we use. And that places law in a position where it's saying, We're not making political decisions. That's for those partisan people. We're making decisions on the basis of reasons, on the basis of noble criteria. Indeed, most of the criteria are known and they're contestable. What could be fairer? What could be better for you? And as we do that, because we believe we're a cohesive society, one that lives on the basis of consensus, law finds foundational principles which give us that cohesion, which give us that consensus. So in particular what it does, it puts those foundational principles in legal form so that it can interpret it, those foundational principles. It, as the law, can discern its meanings and adapt it as social circumstances change, as they continuously do. That is the idea. And so on those basic building blocks, you can build your frameworks of regulation, because they'll be accountable to these foundational principles, which in turn will guarantee our consensus. That is the picture that law offers us all. And it's a very fetching picture, of course, isn't it? It's something that we really should admire. Rationality instead of power and politics. And foundational principles which supposedly are hooked into our very souls and spirits as members of society. What could be better than that? So in the largest labor and the best, I think, elaboration of what capital labor regulatory system should look like in Canada a long time ago, it's the best we've had, it actually states what those foundational principles are. Because they know that is the way that law is going to present itself. And they want to have a regulatory system that reflects that legal idea. And so they said, the basic principles are that we should live as people who believe in the sanctity of private property ownership, in the sanctity of freedom of contract, and in the ideal of free individualism. And that is the basis on which we build capital labor regulatory system. So the assumption has to be, and this is the orthodox assumption, and I won't go through, I won't give you references and all that, of course, but this, you're going to have to trust me. The assumption is that when people come together to produce goods and services in order to create the wealth that we as a society need, when they come together for that purpose, they do so willingly. And they do so willingly because even though they may have disagreements, and even though there are different roles in the production efforts, even though all through there are differences in locale and people and starting positions, we know that there will be hitches and bumps. But in the end, they agree willingly because they share the goals of the system with all the other people who are in that chain. They share the values of that system, which are reflected in these principal foundational documents, which have been given legal status: private property, freedom of contract, individualism. That is how it's done. Now, it's a good idea, but I'm skeptical. And the reason I'm skeptical is just the outcomes of this good idea. That worries me. This brings me to chapter 12 of this 12-chapter book. And it's built around the motto of my old high school. That motto was, honor the work. And we had a nice ditty to go with it. which we had to sing every morning. It was quite inspiring until I found out, as I was a bit older, that in fact this is old stuff. There is no one who doesn't say all of the work. Religious teachers say it, community pundits on podia say it, and vocational guidance teachers say it, some ethicists say it, some social psychologists say it, some people who are interested in criminal law reform or prison reform say it, and of course judges say it. They love it more than anyone else. They really love this stuff. And so judges are always saying things like, oh, well, you should like work, because work makes you feel satisfied, because you're making a contribution to your fellow citizens. And work should satisfy you also because it's a component part, if you're doing it properly, of your very identity. And it gives you self-esteem and feeling of emotional well-being and self-respect. And of course, it enhances dignity that you seek in your life. These are all quotes, by the way. So it seems as if going to work to make a living is just an incidental result. It's just an afterthought, right, that has come along. All right. That takes me to chapter 11. Chapter 11 is about occupational health and safety, regulation, in which I have some interest. And and I'm just using it for the numbers. Now I want to tell you now, so that you know, because you don't know what I'm like, I always use the most conservative numbers around, because otherwise I get into trouble with conservatives that are making things up. So I use their numbers. Right? Last year was actually a bonanza for people who had compensable claims. It was 343,000 something. That's unusual. For the last number of years before that, it was around 277,000 people who had hurts that were compensable. Now, that could be anything from requiring a 2-day absence to death. Right? It's a big range. For instance, in Ontario, these hurts result, we estimate, into 15,000 long-term disabilities every year, and there are different people each year, every year. A lot of people are getting hurt. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, because a lot of people don't have compensable claims even though they're hurt, because they're not eligible, because they're not employees. There's something called independent contractors. They do exactly the same thing, of course, but they're independent contractors. Or they're on visas, or migrant workers' permits, and things of that nature which disqualify them. Worse than that, there are many hurts which are non-compensable, like emotional stresses of one kind or another are very, very hard to have compensated. And so are many diseases which we don't relate to the place of work. And we know that many people who have potentially compensable claims do not make them. I won't go through why not. You can read the chapter at your leisure. An awful lot of people get hurt. And their families suffer. Their whole lives change. I wonder how they feel about work and consensus and shared goals and shared values. If you take that globally, it's something like 2.3 million people get killed annually. 2.3 million. That's 6,000 a day. But there is no class struggle, says the law. 260 million are injured every year different people every year. 160 million are afflicted by diseases related to occupations. Every year, different people and all their families. And one of the things you'll notice, I've just given you numbers, haven't I? But they're people. They're people. And what kind of people are they? Amongst them, you will scarcely find, if you ever do find, one single boss. You'll rarely find a senior manager. And you'll certainly not find any judges. Is there a class problem? What's this consensus stuff? How do these people feel? And how do the people feel over what we call forced labor? Often is known as modern slavery. But basically what it is people who are forced to work or cannot leave because of violence being perpetrated against them, intimidation, coercion, deceptions, abuses of all kinds. 27.5 million of them around the world, including in Ontario, by the way. There was a nice expose in the Stand not so long ago. How do those people feel about all of consensus stuff? Those shared value stuff, and their families, and all that. How do they feel, you think? Similarly. By the way, it's very profitable. Those people inflicting violence and intimidation and deception and other abuses. Last year the ILO told me, and I believe everything they tell me, last year they made $253 billion out of that. Have they got the same goals as the people they're intimidating? The same value system? Can anybody? It's hard to believe that anybody even says that, right? What about the people who work in so-called economic free zones? Maquiadoras, export-free zones, where the whole purpose, there are 45 million of those, where the purpose, the only single purpose of their existence is to make sure that employer costs are reduced by not protecting indigenous people or the environment or the workers. And that's true of all the migrant workers we get here for agricultural purposes, and the people we get on special visas. They have to work, we get them to work under conditions that superior but ordinary Canadians will not accept. How do we feel about all of that consensus stuff, as we call it? The chapter is quite long, there's lots of them. I don't know, I'll just give them a couple of my favorites, then I'll stop with that and go on with what I'm supposed to do. One of my favorite examples is that outfits like McDonald's, and this is an American example, so you have to forgive me, people like McDonald's and Walmart pay their employees insufficiently well, so they can't survive on their earnings. McDonald's and Walmart and some other outfits like that actually help them fill in the welfare forms as they apply for welfare. That's what they do. Last year that cost the US Treasury $159 billion to subsidize your chips at McDonald's. That must make for a lot of dignity and self-respect and self-esteem, doesn't it? Or people here, at a much smaller level, people who work and then have to turn up to a food bank to make sure their families have something to eat. Undoubtedly their dignity is enhanced by being able to work. There can be no question of that. Or more recently, and I will stop more. I probably won't. And more recently, there was the Ford government, which I think everybody in this room quite admires. The Ford government was offered us new provision, a statute, announcing that this would enhance the dignity of long-distance truck drivers. From now on, those truck drivers will be permitted to use the washrooms at the places where they deliver or pick up. Now there is dignity for you. Oh, mustn't get angry. And then, of course, you know the history of work. The assembly lines, it looks like a fairly old audience. You probably remember Upton Sinclair and the Jungle and Robert Dressel, the ragged trousers philanthropists who talk about these dreadful conditions that existed and still exist, it turns out. And you've seen movies like Modern Times or How Green Was My Valley, or maybe seen the photographs by Lewis Hines, who photographed the exploitation of children in the United States and never got another job, by the way. So to expose that. And by the way, child labor is making a big comeback in America, using undocumented families' children. You can see how the families would say, well, it's not so bad, we share their values. It's so obvious, isn't it? And then I'm not even talking about all the people who commit suicide at work because it's so bad. France Telecom is a good example. Foxconn became the Taiwanese thing, which makes all the things that make you feel happy when you walk around and measure your footsteps and so on. Very strange thing to do. But anyhow. So you have that. Foxconn actually excused itself, its justification for having an extraordinary number of people commit suicide for just working in their factories, said, well, we're not so bad, everybody else does it. Shared values, consensus everywhere you look. Right? And I'm not even talking about what the late David Graeber described as bullshit jobs. You remember, I don't know how many of you have read that book, but basically he did surveys about how people feel about their work. Not in terms, you can't measure whether people feel good or bad, you're asking questions. The question that he focused on was, do you think that your work, that you do every day, contributes to society? 35 to 45%, depending on where the surveys came from, said, not at all. We don't do a damn thing for society. Imagine how they feel every day at work. Must be uplifting. Now all this, of course, just is down to capitalism. Has nothing to do with law, right? That's all down to capitalism, and I blame it for that. But having said that, what you get out of that is it is clear that it is systematic. This is not just the odd malfunction. This is a... Oh no. Oh, unleashing me. Yeah. Thank you. This is not just the odd happening, the odd thing gone wrong, a bad apple in the barrel. This is a business model that I'm talking about. What is true then about capitalism, I would say, is that while work in a different society might indeed be uplifting, it indeed might be so, but it cannot be so under capitalism. But what you'll also have noticed, because I can see how bright you are, is that all these excesses, all these hurts, all these repressions, all these oppressions, all these exploitations of vulnerabilities are either legally permitted or legally facilitated. There's hardly an illegal act amongst them. back to these building blocks. The rest of the book, of course, is an, oh goodness me. The rest of this book is about an interrogation of how law participates in this way of creating wealth for our society. Now you notice that I read out what was the standard understanding of labor relations regulators and, of course, all other spheres of regulation, that the building blocks are private property, ownership, freedom to contract, and individualism. Let me start with individualism. That's a relatively recent phenomenon in history. Before that, of course, we had, before we got to capitalism and liberalism, we had feudalism, where everybody was set up in a hierarchical setting, where power stemmed from the top down on the basis of religious or military power in one way or another, which was handed down. People owed each other fealty depending on where they were on the ladder, and if you had nothing in the ladder, all you owed was fealty. And you could not get out of that trap because of your special talents or resources or ideas or imagination or anything like that. There was no way out. That's where you were. Your individuality did not matter. So there were repressions of all these people that could be made to work. Slavery, poor laws, master and servant laws, which lasted well into the 19th century. Kept these people under command. They had to listen, they had to stay, they could be criminals if they did, if they stay, if they went to another master, they could criminalize, if they were insolent, insubordinate, and talked back, revolted, got together with some other poor buggers and said, let's end this! They would be squashed by law. But that made sense under feudalism. That made sense. Individualism now, however, is new. New Enlightenment, liberal idea comes along, and then individualism. But what do we mean by that in law? Well, it means we don't care about your attributes in any way whatsoever. They're yours. We honor each and every individual in the same way. We don't care whether you're tall or short, and I like that, of course. We don't care whether you're thin or fat. We don't care whether you're artistic or clumsy. I like that too. We don't care whether you're intelligent or not so intelligent. Whether you're physically dexterous or not. None of that matters. You are an individual, unique, deserve the same standing in law as all the others, regardless of your personal attributes. And what's more, it doesn't matter whether you're, I don't know, male, female, whatever. It doesn't matter whether you're pink, brown, or black. I like pink, by the way. It came from a film I once saw where a black man said to a judge, you keep on talking to me as a black man. He said, it was in South Africa, of course. And he said, I'm not black, I'm brown. And you're not what? You're pink. Doesn't matter whether you're pink, brown, black. Doesn't matter at all. To the law, and therefore to our politics, we say. That doesn't matter in any way whatsoever. We respect your right to think as you like and to act as you like, subject to some coordinating rules. That's all we ask of you. Well, you can see immediately that if these individuals decide to enter what we today call a contract, but an arrangement of promises that they make to each other in very serious manner, then obviously the law must recognize that as a valid and enforceable arrangement. And it should never interfere with them, those arrangements. It dares to make because they're sovereign individuals. The problem is that one of the differences we don't account for, we also don't think is important, like being thin or tall, is this property thing. So if an individual has property, treated by law in this way, this kind of law, as the same as one who has no property. Now there are very few people with property. You know all about inequality, I won't go through that, although I do have a favorite illustration. Oh God, just come on. Favorite illustration. And it was done by the Center of MacDonald, I think, at the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives about 10 years ago. And I really like this example. I'll tell you why in a minute. And he came up with the number that in Canada, 0.002% of Canadians, 0.002% of Canadians, that is 86 people, have as much wealth as 11.4 million Canadians who occupy the bottom rungs of the wealth ladder. 86, 11.4. You can see what's going to happen. By the way, the reason I like it, 86 is roughly the number of people in my building. So, you can see what happens when those people who have no property must enter into an agreement with an individual who has property. That deal is not going to be a good one for the individual without property. That's going to be one hell of a bad deal, consensus or not. Right? So workers are forced to do two things. They've always done them, and they will always do it until we get rid of this system. They try to reduce their numbers. They combine. They form trade unions. So they don't have so many numbers bidding for the one job. That's one of the things they do. That, of course, offends our basic platform. The foundation. Individualism. You're combining, what is this? Unacceptable. The other thing they do, of course, is they want to vote, because they realize there are many of them. And if they could only have a vote and influence a government to not force them into these damn lousy deals, they would be better off. It's workers who not only fought for the franchise, but in order to get it, fought for freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to associate, because they needed that to get the right to vote. Remember that when you hear all the talk about freedoms in our society. Oh, I shouldn't preach at you. So, they do that. Well, of course, they're met with instant reaction. And I'll just do a couple of these and then I'll mercifully stop. Oh, no, it's only 5 to 8. I go to bed at 8:30. No. What happens early on as capitalism truly comes out, say, late 18th, early 19th century in Europe. But there are already all sorts of laws against combinations, because under feudalism you couldn't combine either. That actually remains the same, right? Big change, big regime change, except it's the same. So they combine. You can't combine. That's a criminal offense. Workers fight back. That's what they do. They have to, they have no choice. And they fight in many ways. Sometimes violently, sometimes fisting, sometimes by disappearing, absconding. I don't know what they did. They fought back. They tried to get the franchise. They're continuously clawing away at trying to get the franchise. They're fighting like mad. As they do this, changes come about. People become more sensitive to what they have to do for them. So they say, okay, you can be repealing that combine stuff that stops you from combining, but you can regulate, bargain and negotiate with your employer over your own terms and conditions. You can't enforce them, of course, but you can do that. Provided you don't intimidate anyone, you don't molest anyone, you don't obstruct anyone, and you don't use any violence. And of course you can't strike. Big improvement. Now, of course, the defenders of individualism and private property, notably the judiciary at this stage, comes out and says, hey, we can make use of these exceptions, molestation, obstruction, right? And rein in these combinations which attack individuals who just fortunately happen to have some property. Because they're individuals too. So, I don't know, I'm going to skip 30, 40 years forward. It doesn't really matter, right? You don't care about any of these things. It's just an image you should have. 40 years later, trade unions are allowed to be formed in the sense that they're no longer illegal. In other words, you can form a combination which is made up of workers, and you're a trade union which is not per se illegal in any way. Of course, you can't enforce any agreement you get, but you got that much. You got this much. That pleases trade unions. There were several royal commissions of inquiry, just as we do that over meddling and all these things that we have to do to get to any kind of reform, right? They did all of that. All of that's the same. None of that's ever changed. So they got that, and they got to this point. Having got to that point, those who preserve individualism, especially the individualism of private property owners, said, well, yes, you can combine. We can't say no to that. Government has spoken. We can't say no to that. But of course, if you do anything while your combination, that is unlawful. Trespass, create a nuisance, scream abuse, you shouldn't be abusing, defaming somebody, that will be unlawful. Or even if you don't do any of these things, if it is your intention, we're talking about a combination here, by the way, if it's your intention to hurt somebody with your activity, another union, or another worker, or worst of all, your employer. If that's your intention, both these reasons are reasons for holding you as having committed a criminal act of criminal conspiracy. To Australia you go. So, the people who are at this stage responding to union movements have to amend that, because clearly the courts have now defeated what was their purpose. So they say we'll take away this criminal conspiracy possibility from the judiciary. They can no longer do that. Courts crash under their wings, think a bit, clap them another good, right? A good gimmick. Okay, it's not criminal, but nobody said it wasn't a civil wrong. You can bring an action in tort. Now, for those of you who don't care about these things, all that means is that somebody says they've committed an unlawful act, or they intended to hurt me, and so therefore I have an action that I can bring for damages. But I don't want really damages, because they've got no money after all. I don't really want damages. What I want is for you to stop them by granting me an injunction to stop them from acting like that. And if they disobey the injunction, Australia they go. Gradually, especially in England, workers win protections against all these things. And I'll stop with that. In the book somewhere I described this, I told about tonight at dinner. It's sort of like picking bones out of tofu, isn't it? In England, the remedies that unions sought was to say, well, you can't bring any of these actions that you've been bringing over the century or so against us anymore if we're involved in a trade dispute. Everything comes to hinge on that definition of trade dispute after that. And we don't get that protection except in a couple of places in the colonies. In the colonies, that is not equal at all. We don't do that. So, but we, just digressing, because the whole thing is a digression. In Australia and New Zealand, two of the jurisdictions I look at from time to time in the book, in Australia and New Zealand, they were so badly beaten by all these individualism, private property, freedom of contract laws that they decided not to play anymore. And they got themselves a system called compulsory arbitration. They were willing to submit themselves to a third party which was going to decide what the terms and conditions of employment should be. When I first came here to Canada, people said, oh, that must be terrible, no voluntarism in Australia, wow! Nobody noticed they had better conditions. They had much better conditions than we ever got here. And unions were much more powerful as an institutionalized political agent than they ever had before. But no, that's just fine. That's a true digression. The Australians and New Zealanders opted out. When much later, capital begins to fight back after it felt it had lost ground in the post-Second World War. After, in the late 60s, early 70s, this begins, right through the 80s, and of course, after that you all know it, Thatcherism and Reaganism, Mulroneyism, all the isms you like. Right? The fight back was on. As the fight back was on, the employer class, notice that word, the employer class reached out for those old tort and criminal remedies and legitimated their attack upon trade unionism with that. In England, where they'd won virtual immunity for most of their actions, the attack came from the judiciary once again. They made it easier to get injunctions. I won't go through the details of that. And they completely diluted the meaning of trade dispute. And they're back roughly where they were in 1906. So the picture I'm offering is this. Foundation. Principles. Everything is built on them. They promote things which are absolutely injurious to the working class. They produce consumer injury. As a result of that, when the injured class tries to fight back within this system, it may make gains, but the same system allows them to be rolled back at all times. So progress is almost impossible if you fight within that scheme. Real progress, or sorry, progress is the wrong word, transformative change is impossible within that scheme. I've only done one other chapter. I will stop there. I'll give you just one small example of what that means. This applies to all spheres of struggle that workers have to face, by the way. I'll just use trade unions and bargaining for the moment. And by the way, I won't go, you all know about the way we unionize here and we bargain here. Our system, our legitimate system, our system that we fight to retain as it's being attacked daily, is only one step above individual bargaining. It could be, as the famous Wobblies once said, the whole of the working class against the whole of the employing class. It could be nationwide, it could be region-wide, it could be industrial-wide. All these things exist, and partially exist here from time to time. Could be all of that. But no, we just have planet by planet bargaining. Planet. One step above individual employer, we have union employer. But that employer. That makes it very difficult for unions to make demands of a social kind, because their employer can't give in to that. So if they want to do it, they have to transcend the boundaries that the law, that of course puts their status always in peril. It's very difficult to motivate trade unions in that way, therefore. It's not as impossible again, and it's not that it shouldn't be done, but the burden of law is heavy. I should do that. One example, then many, you know of course, that what the employers want from their workers are a number of things. They want work for wages. They don't actually care how they get it. They've done it in any number of ways. Over time, the contract of employment became the major tool by which it was done. So workers, of course, realizing that there was a disadvantage, tried to bejewel that contract by having, through their numbers, their political numbers, have governments insert certain conditions which they could never get by themselves. Workers' compensation is tied to you having a contract of employment. I mentioned that before. Your pensions are, severance pay, minimum wages, maximum hours, overtime pay, and so on. Being paid on time. Because if there was no such provision, you would not be. They fought for that. That is, they forced the contract of employment to contain things which were not bargained for by sovereign individuals. Against the whole grain. That's what those things are. That's, of course, what I hated. And so, inevitably, the employer says, well, yeah, you're entitled to maybe to overtime for that whole period that you worked for me. But only if you were an employee under a contract of employment. I think you were an independent contractor. And then there's a whole fight. Because the employer doesn't care how it is. More importantly, the employer can cut itself up. That's the beauty of, by the way, is one of the major utilities of the corporation. It can set up a whole integrated firm which acts as an integrated whole, but pretends that it's all a series of individual employers or actors. By doing so, the eventual beneficiary of the work for wages can simply say, I have no contract with that person. That is, they've introduced intermediaries to prevent the private contract between individuals to exist. And you see that with employment agencies being used. You see that with franchisors, franchisees relationship. You see that with the platform workers. You see, enough. Yeah? You see all of that. Now, what employers also need, and this is it, what employers also need, of course, they have a difficulty. Even though they have all this power, and the workers are in such trouble as they compete for the scarce jobs they have to have in order to live. And notice that consensus seems to be receding, doesn't it? They're in classic opposition. All legalized. All legalized. It's not that I'm saying anything new about class. It is that the law embraces it and supports it. So, what they need many things. They need women. I notice there's a lot of discussion. They need women to reproduce children for nothing. That's important. Right? You've got to have more numbers to compete for those scarce jobs. You've got to keep that up. Yeah, just for your amusement. I come from Australia from time to time. In Australia we had a treasurer not so long ago who was worried about the population decline. And he came up with a budget. And he said, well, what I want to do is I'm going to give a credit for any family that has a third child. And his motto was, 1 for the mother, 1 for the father, and 1 for Australia. And you get a credit. It was prompt because Australians are quite good with words. This was called the bonking budget. They need lots of things, but the one thing they really can't be sure of, not only can they not be sure how much they will get for the product they appropriate that's produced, socially produced, by the way, by their workers, for to go into that private individual coffer, they can't be sure what they'll get for that product in the market, because the market is also competitive. So that's a worry. So the whole idea is to press down on the cost that they have to. But they also have another problem. What is it when they engage a worker to work for wages? Well, they buy what the language tells you, the books tell you, is the worker's capacity, or in different words, labor power. They don't buy a precise amount of work. They don't have that, because that comes from the worker's intelligence, from the worker's flexibility, from the worker's physical soundness, willingness, dexterity, skills. It comes from that which makes the worker as an individual, something we love. And he's bought it. And he wants to use it for himself, not for the individual. Now, how can he be sure? By the way, that is the greatest element of what the book's called Alienation, and it is the core element of all class struggle. This fight about how much people give up when they agree to work for somebody else, of themselves. So, what can we do? And Law ponders this. They've got these wigs on. What do we do? We'll imply some terms in every contract of employment. Now remember that whole thing? No, we're not monkeying around with individuals entering into contract. Never touch that. Let them do what they like. It's theirs to decide what should be in the contract. Except for these terms we're going to force on them. The terms are to exercise reasonable care and skill. And I think that's really not necessary. My experience is that workers mostly want to do the best they can when they're working. But that's it. Secondly, a duty of loyalty and good faith. Now, I won't go to the all these terms, by the way, everything I've said leads to huge legal argumentation, litigation, definitional problems, all of this, which are bread and butter and really quite fascinating. But the reality is, duty of good faith and loyalty simply means that the worker must put the employer's interest before his own. That's what it eventually means. That's why it's so difficult to get a whistleblower legislation right. And finally, what the employer needs most is a duty of obedience. Obedience! As that report that I mentioned at the beginning said, the contract is one of that has a nexus between a superior and an inferior. Obedience! Imagine if I go and sell my umbrella to one of you. I've got a good one. And you buy the umbrella. And then you say to me, but I bought the umbrella and I've given you some money, please kneel for me. Kneel! And that applies to every contract, whether it's a contract under common law, under statutory law, or under a collective agreement. And if you fail to meet the standard, loyalty, duty, obedience, the employer, watch my lips, can punish you. Punish you. Under collective agreements, we're very proud that we've worked out a system where the union can come in and argue about what the level of punishment you can imagine. But punishment! Now, in our supposed system, based on this philosophy of liberalism and individualism, no one but the state should use powers to punish anyone when it's absolutely necessary. And what I just said shows you that in the private sector, when it comes to employment, the private sector employer has the powers of a state vis-a-vis the employees. It is the government. And remember, it's hierarchical, a bit like feudalism, especially if you have a corporation in there. You know, it's hierarchical, and it presses down. And it has the right of obedience. That, of course, makes workers more malleable, work harder, extract more of that labor power. which is otherwise not quantifiable. And the aims of that punishment is to deter the particular employee who has behaved wrongfully under this rubric, to generally deter all other employees and teach them what it's like to be employees if they want a job, and to remedy them. Oh, might send you to rehabilitation school, or Alcoholic Anonymous, or we'll give you an anger training course. Individuals, autonomous, so on. What happened to them? Capitalist law happened to them. We have a system. That's it. There are several $1,000 examples. I'll stop. We have a system, really, that calls itself liberal capitalist democracy. We say that all the time. I've even heard Trudeau say it. It turns out that the liberal and democracy part in labor relations law are subjugated to the capital. It isn't there. As long as we fight within that framework, and many of you fight, many of you might fight on the other side for all I know. As long as you're in that system, you will not get any change from the lack of consensus, from the lack of shared goals, from the lack of shared norms. You'll never get any relief. It's an ugly system, and it's going to continue. So what do I want? I don't know. If I knew, of course, I'd be doing it. But I do want some things. I hope that everybody who's forced to struggle within the system, and there is no other system to work in, you're forced into the system as you ask for better wages, more minimum wage, more sick pay. You're within that system. There's no way out. As you fight within that system, I want you to think and become conscious about the role that that system is playing in shaping and confining your struggle. Confront that system, ask questions about it, and tell your comrades about it. Because while it would not change, would not bring down capitalism if we changed the law significantly, or even got rid of some of it. It would not bring down capitalism by itself. It is a system, its own logic, its own thing. And that's not going to happen. But I think, although it's not a sufficient step, it's a necessary one. And I'll finish with a quote. I've just remembered. I meant to do that about half an hour ago. Yeah, it's from Chomsky, talking in a different setting, of course. But he said, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within the spectrum. That's where we are. Thank you.